Ronan, Mullen and Ciaran Bradley are on the line with us to discuss Alex Ferguson's story. 1998 went out on ITV. One of the weirder, more grainy footage of Alex Ferguson's tenure at Manchester United. And it's probably most interesting thing about this, Ronan, is that this documentary went out. I know at this stage United had some success under Alex Ferguson, but this really predates the treble that took them into a different stratosphere and the subsequent Premier League titles, FA Cup titles and second Champions League title under Ferguson as well.
Yeah, if anything, just after the whole Ferguson project took off at Manchester United, this is probably one of the lower points. They could have chosen to do a documentary where it felt like Arsene Wenger was the new kid in town and maybe Ferguson's methods had been outstripped a little bit. So it was an interesting time for them to choose to do it. Obviously predated the most successful season in the club's history, so good timing in that regard. But really good insight, I think, for a 60-minute documentary or a little bit less. They really cram a lot in and get across the whole Alex Ferguson ethos, how it infiltrated Manchester United and the foundations for the success, really.
Is it good timing or bad timing? Surely the following season would have been good timing.
In retrospect, I think it's good timing because it lays bare the shortcomings in terms of, I think he admits himself towards the end that the squad was a little bit threadbare, and they obviously subsequently signed Dwight York, Jesper Blomqvist, and probably most notably Jaap Stam, who came in and shored up what looked like a bit of a creaky defence in the footage we saw. David May had come on there to try and shore up things. Never the most solid option. I wouldn't have said. No disrespect to David May, he was a decent operator, but not on Jaap Stam's level. And then we saw the likes of Ben Thornley. He had some good flashes, but we had him on the show recently, and he probably never hit the heights that he'd been pegged for. But it kind of sparked in Ferguson's mind the need for recruitment, and that turned out to be solid investments, I should say. Yeah,
and I suppose, Ciaran, one of the more interesting things about this is that, as Ronan pointed out there, like the following season, the 1999 treble, like people hold that squad in esteem of one of the greatest teams ever to play in the Premiership or Premier League. And in this 1998 season, you really see that there was a serious amount of building that had to be done because the squad just wasn't good enough at that stage. And I suppose you can kind of point out and see the weaknesses of that side and how Alex Ferguson really built upon it the following season.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things there. This was really the first season where Arsene Wenger's impact at Arsenal had really started to show, particularly the recruitment of Nicolas Anelka. I remember most of my mates at school were Arsenal fans, and he was absolutely superb that season. He really carried them. So this was probably the first period by which Ferguson realised, right, I really need to up my game here. And that's kind of where Ferguson is at his best. But as we've seen over the course of his whole United career, obviously the sort of mid-2000s as well, there are periods of adjustment. I thought, the injuries are obviously very much undermined the middle of the season. I seem to remember Roy Keane and also I believe Enda Coll was out for a significant period too. He was adjusting to it, and it was quite interesting seeing the situation in the boardroom as well. That relationship, how Ferguson is with the rest of the board and with the chief executive Martin Edwards as well. So you get the feeling that actually it was interesting because one of the fans actually said, look, there was money there for him and he didn't take it. So I found that quite interesting, given that Ferguson, you would imagine, would take everything that is available to his means to get to the end goal.
Yeah, and we'll touch on the amazing fan footage from absolute pub talkers later on, because that's
literally
it's a real bonus to this. It's fantastic stuff that this was included in a documentary that has behind the scenes access to some of the biggest stars at this point, that they still went down the pub and got the lads' opinions on how United were doing. But
my question, Enda, is this: why would you go for Marcelo Salas when you've got John Curtis?
Well, that's it. I mean, Salas, he was destined to be the key star at United at this point in time. But I suppose this documentary is largely based around Alex Ferguson, and this is still early doors Alex Ferguson. I suppose not many people at this point in time would have known that he would still go on to manage United up until 2013. So maybe that's why they did it at this point in time. But it goes back to his time at Saint Mirren, and that was his first job. And one of the main interesting things that I took from that was when the Saint Mirren chairman, or ex-chairman at the time of the documentary was filmed, spoke about how Alex Ferguson came in and took over the club in every sense of the word, be that the transfers, be that the finances, the players that they're bringing in, the academy. He really just had an overreaching brief that really took over the club, sort of like a dictatorship. But he said it was absolutely to the betterment of the club. And Ronan, that's sort of what he did at United later on in his career, and largely what he did at Aberdeen as well. And it's amazing to me that at the age of 32, when he took the Saint Mirren job, that he had the confidence to do that, and even at that stage he had the authority to take over everything in the club and bring it up to a level that he wanted.
St Mirren thing's interesting because it's always brought up when a manager fails in their first job that, oh well, Ferguson was sacked by Saint Mirren, he didn't do too well, but that's obviously dispelled in this documentary, where it was more of a clash of personalities at the top end of that club, that, as you alluded to there, Ferguson probably wanted a bit too much control that the St Mirren board were unwilling to allot him, basically. I think Willie Todd says in the documentary, I'm sure he regrets it. I'm not so sure he does, Willie. I think he did. I think Ferguson did pretty well post St Mirren, and did unbelievable stuff with Aberdeen, as you said. And the ethos, it says at the start of the documentary that Paisley grew up in the shadow of Glasgow, and it kind of, it's like Ferguson's mindset is rooted from birth, that he feels like an underachiever, or he needs to knock someone off their effing perch, even if it's his fellow countrymen. So that kind of goes all the way through from St Mirren, trying to establish them. Aberdeen, did magical things with Aberdeen. I think if he had stayed with Aberdeen for another few years and then retired from football, that in itself is an impressive footballing legacy, what he did there. But then to bring that ethos and instill it into Manchester United, which was such a storied football team anyway, and to put an imprint on par with the likes of Matt Busby in pretty much no time. He obviously had a shaky first couple of years, which I'm sure we'll get to, but by the time it was all said and done, he's basically on the, to use an off-the-ball term, and on the Mount Rushmore of Manchester United. And that was very clear that those early intricacies which he established in his early managerial career were still there by the time he stepped away.
Well, knowing the sort of history of the off-the-ball Mount Rushmore, it's Alex Ferguson wouldn't be guaranteed to get on the Man United Mount Rushmore. I mean, you look at the Kilkenny one, and it didn't have Brian Cody or Henry Shefflin on it. So is Alex Ferguson really, is his legacy? There might be a little bit of revisionism when it comes to Mount Rushmore for Man United. Was he really that good? Did he? I remember this time last year on Team 33, we spoke about Alex Ferguson, and someone started bringing up the fact that, was he actually a good manager, or did he just appoint good coaching staff? So, I mean, there's a lot of revisionism that goes into these things. But I suppose looking at his Aberdeen career, and again, I mentioned the fact that at Saint Mirren he sort of took over the club as a dictatorship and wanted control of everything. That was part one of Ferguson starting to mould himself as a manager, and Aberdeen was really a progression of that. And when you see him sort of bringing in younger players, but also just the ethos of, number one, blaming the press, saying the press is against you, and number two, having real star quality but knowing how to treat them. So the likes of Gordon Strachan would have been the best player in Scotland at this point. So he really benefited from that, but he brought him forward to a level that he didn't have. And Ciaran, I suppose Aberdeen is one of these stories that, if you look back now, they're the last team that have won the Scottish League that weren't Celtic or Rangers. Alex Ferguson was the manager of that. The legacy that he left there in the short period of time he was there is almost as good as the legacy he left at United for the long period he was there.
You could make the argument for sure that he made an even bigger impact on that town than he did on Manchester, because Manchester 2 club city, obviously. What he did with Aberdeen was, Graham Hunter, obviously we have on the show a lot, and is a big Aberdeen fan. And I mean, the regard in which he is held in Aberdeen is unparalleled. To take them to the title cups and the Cup Winners' Cup, being Real Madrid in the final, it's out of this world. And the ability, the conditions, by the way, for that match are absolutely hilarious. That even when ahead at all, I mean, there's about a half a foot of standing water, which you have to imagine is going to, I would imagine, favour Aberdeen rather than Real Madrid. So yeah, I mean, it was absolutely remarkable what he did there, and I think it's testament, obviously, to his drive, to his will to win. What we always hear about Ferguson is that he's the first into the training ground and the last to leave, and this is what you get when you've got that absolute desire to get what you want. And I think he probably benefited from, the disparity maybe not being quite as stark as it possibly would be now. Look, I mean, this is all relative, so you're not doing down any of his achievements in any respect. By the way, I'm saying that because I don't want him to come after me with a baseball bat, which is apparently what he did while he was at Saint Mirren with Archie Knox, which sounds like something Begbie would do, or like the opening scene of Taggart. So he's, I mean, it was absolutely unbelievable achievement, and, that will live long in the memory.
Well, I suppose the interesting part about this documentary in itself is that there have been other documentaries on Alex Ferguson and on the class of '92, and they have the real feel of sort of a PR job, whereas this is a real, like, behind the scenes. You get chatting to people who were involved in it. The likes of Gordon Strachan is actually really good in this. You've got the classic Gordon Strachan wit, even in his younger days. The likes of Alex McLeish, who looked about 50 years younger than I remember him ever looking. And you even have a few appearances from his family as well. And if you closed your eyes during this documentary, I bet you any amount of money in the world you would not be able to tell the difference between Alex Ferguson and Martin, his brother, when he was on. Anytime he's speaking and it's a cutaway, it's not on his face, you'd imagine it's Alex Ferguson talking. But when they're building up towards the Cup Winners' Cup final in Gothenburg against Real Madrid, Martin is chatting, and his wife Kathy is chatting as well about how the women of Aberdeen are delighted that the men are all going off and taking the children to this game, and how much an event it was and how much it encapsulated the city. But Martin, Ronan, I know you enjoyed this part. Martin Ferguson was not happy with a round of drinks that he bought after the Aberdeen had brought home the cup.
Oh, it was very funny. Like, he said it as a joke and nice little light-hearted anecdote, but you could see the steel in his eyes that he was furious that he got absolutely ripped off by these barmen. But you're totally right. It's the John Fury, Tyson Fury dynamic, where you just have to make sure you're staring at the screen at all times to make sure you know who's speaking. But I know you've covered Forest in recent weeks, and just the thought that Forest or Aberdeen could be competing with the likes of Real Madrid at the top end of European football speaks to how football has changed in the last 40 years or so. And, like, I think one of the knocks on Ferguson, which in some departments is justified, I'd be interested to hear what Ciaran thinks of it, but his tactical approach in Europe maybe was a little bit naive at times and maybe let him down in some of the bigger games where he probably should have stepped away from Manchester United with more than 2 European Cups. There are some obvious ones that are maybe beyond his control, where Barcelona were just in a different stratosphere in the 2 finals they played, the second one in particular, actually. But there were probably semi-finals where he was let down. But you can't discount what he did with Aberdeen to win that European competition when the Cup Winners' Cup was, if not on par with the European Cup, the gap was certainly slimmer than it is at the moment. And then one of the most feted nights in Manchester United's history is that Mark Hughes goal when they beat Barcelona. So similarly, to say he didn't leave an imprint on European football during his time at Manchester United and his footballing career generally is a misnomer.
Ciaran, what's your thoughts on that? Like, I mean, I suppose if you look at their league success, it's probably comparable with the likes of Pep Guardiola now, because does Pep Guardiola have the same imprint that he should have on Europe? He did it with his Barcelona side, but did he really have the impact in Europe that he would have wanted? Because Alex Ferguson is similar than that. Should he have won more European competitions with Man United?
Well, he's on record as saying he should have done, so I'm certainly not going to disagree. But I do think that we're often we can often overlook luck in these situations, like a certain bounce of the ball. the ones that really stand out, I think, would be Leverkusen in 2002. That was really a final that United should have been playing in. Like, the thing is, with his reign, like, it's over such a long period of time, obviously 26, 27 years, that you've got all these factors going into it. So, for example, throughout the late 80s, early 90s, like, Serie A is where it is. Serie A is where the money is. That's where the players are going. That's where the best players are going. So the Division 1 and the Premier League are playing second fiddle in that respect. In terms of tactics, yeah, I mean, he probably could have done, like, the losses in Europe that really stick in my mind are like the 4-0 at the Nou Camp in '94. But that was obviously due to the fact that they couldn't really play half the European players that they had. The ones that really stick out in terms of a tactical sense, like, I think would be Milan in kind of 2007, where, I mean, they were just imperious. So with that diamond of Gattuso, Pirlo and Kaká at the tip of it, like, they absolutely ripped United apart. And then obviously Barcelona, as Wayne Rooney's spoken about during the week, of trying to go toe-to-toe with them, probably a little bit of ego playing in there. So in the longest answer that I've ever given on Team 33, we'll have to wrap up and say that, yeah, he probably should have won a little bit more, but I don't hold anything against him for it.
We are chatting about Alex Ferguson, the Alex Ferguson story. 1998, it came out on ITV. We've spoken about the Saint Mirren days and Aberdeen days, but we do want to get more in depth when it comes to the Man United days. But we do have to take a quick break. Back after the break. And you're welcome back to Team 33. Enda Coll here with you. If you want to get involved in the conversation, text us on 53106, or you can tweet us at Team 33. That's all spelled out in words. We are chatting about the Alex Ferguson story, the 1998 documentary that was released on ITV. Ciaran Bradley and Ronan Mullen are on the line with me. Lads, so we've spoken about the Saint Mirren days and the Aberdeen days, but then I suppose what this documentary really is a behind-the-scenes look at Alex Ferguson in his earliest days at Manchester United. So he takes over the job, and I suppose Man United are in a bit of a wreck at this point in time. They haven't won the title in over 20 years, and they're really struggling for a bit of identity. So Ferguson showed at Aberdeen that he could really take over a club and bring them success when it came to domestically and in Europe as well. And that's really what Man United needed. But United needed a real overhaul at this point. Ronan, do you think, looking at it from face value now, I know we know what Alex Ferguson went on to do, but was Alex Ferguson a big enough name, or would he have been appointed nowadays as the Man United manager?
No, it's an interesting question. I suppose the footballing world was a lot smaller back then, and if you're casting your net for a potential manager, what he'd done at Aberdeen revitalised that town and club. I'd say the Manchester United hierarchy were looking at that and thinking we'd like a bit of that if he can bring that sort of energy here. I'm sure they didn't foresee what he ultimately went on to do, but trying to get them competing again at the top end was very much his brief, and it took him a while to do that. This is obviously a well-covered part of the Alex Ferguson story where he was basically on the brink. And one interesting line in this documentary was one of the contributors says that the football was as bad as he'd ever seen it at Old Trafford, and the fans were beginning to turn. So it wasn't as if the project wasn't working or things weren't going his way. There was definitely a mood around Old Trafford that this was another low point for the club, and that kind of puts it in stark perspective that were it not for Mark Robbins, who just he'd get a mention in the Mount Rushmore conversation and just for saving Alex Ferguson's job, but big contributions down the stretch in that FA Cup winning campaign, and that turned things around. To think that an FA Cup win would salvage your job these days is obviously it's a far cry from the way things are. We all know Louis van Gaal was sacked with the FA Cup in his hands, so it just shows how much football has changed in the last few years.
Honestly, I was slightly disappointed when United won that FA Cup because I thought they might keep Louis van Gaal on for another year, and I just couldn't watch United under Louis van Gaal. It was the most boring, monotonous football you're ever going to see. But I suppose if you look at, say, I know United's a bit of a different club now to what they were when Ferguson took over, and that's largely to do with Ferguson and largely to do with why it's so hard to maintain your job at that level now when you're managing United. But take Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, for example. A lot of people were calling for his head very early doors in this career. And with Alex Ferguson, it was similar enough. If Alex Ferguson, Ciaran, was managing United nowadays and his run of form was like that, he's definitely not getting the 4 years before a trophy that he got at the time.
Yeah, you mean now? Like
if he was managing United now, he would not have gotten 4 years.
Yeah, possibly not. I think it's so difficult. Like I was just saying, as you were talking there about Ferguson, I was just thinking about Moyes' appointment, because if you're looking at Ferguson like at Aberdeen, Moyes at Everton was not dissimilar. Like, you know, in a very different context, and obviously not as trophy laden and stuff like that, but he did a hell of a job there. And you could kind of understand some of the logic of giving someone like him time. But obviously, when you need to be able to be seeing the green shoots of improvement. And I think the reason that perhaps Ferguson would have been given time is that you're going to, it's quite a slow process getting these things to kind of come to fruition at all at the same time. So, you know, it was really interesting seeing like his passion, like his burning passion is that I would argue even stronger at what he's probably mid-50s at this stage of this documentary as it was at Saint Mirren. So, I mean, you see him reacting like pre-Liverpool, giving this team talk about stopping McManaman and also stopping Paul Ince, and you just the switch flicks with him. And he's like, and if he starts giving it this big-time Charlie bit, you don't get bullied by him, all right? And, you know, this kind of thing. So it's absolutely fascinating. And I think basically from a board level, you need to be seeing those kind of little green shoots improvements to be able to justify it to yourself and to the shareholders at that stage that you've made the right decision in keeping him on.
Well, that Steve McManaman clip is infamous at this point in time, but it's still one of my favourite parts of this documentary, because you even get the background, the players' thoughts on his obsession with stopping McManaman. They couldn't really understand it, but Ferguson was just like, stop McManaman. That's all you need to do. All you need to do is stop Steve McManaman. Was Steve McManaman that good?
Yes.
Like, because I genuinely don't remember him playing that much, but I obviously he must have been good enough if he was playing for Liverpool and Real Madrid.
No, he was.
Was he the? I suppose Paul Ince is an interesting one, because he moved from United and ended up at Liverpool, and you even see nowadays he still has that cockiness and arrogance, but I don't think he was ever good enough to be at that level of football.
I was like he was very good. Him and Keane in the middle of the park before the emergence of Scholes, like latterly, they were teed tough. I mean, it was very, very difficult to bypass that midfield. But the problem was that he is just a bit of an arsehole, basically. that's the long and the short of it. Like, he is a big time Charlie. He came in with Governor, you know, demanding that people call him Governor. And if you want to cross the wrong person with that kind of thing, it's Ferguson. As we saw with Ryan Giggs when the rest of the squad kind of teased him into going and asking for a club car after 25 games, and him getting short shrift and being told that he doesn't even deserve a club bike. Like, you can imagine how he'd be responding to the likes of Ince.
Well, I have to say I've never heard the term "big time Charlie" before this, but I love it. It's like Frank Lampard saying, giving it the big un after winning one title to Liverpool. Ronan, there's some great nuggets in this. I mean, you see the sort of changes in United under Ferguson. I mean, the changes were dramatic. He was extremely ruthless with many senior pros. The likes of Mark Hughes was gone, Brian Robson was gone, Steve Bruce gone. Like, he really did a number on the senior players and got them out of the club, which he was criticised largely for at this point in time. But we see that they developed on. But you also see in the 90s, when United start to turn a corner and sort of they're moving along with society in terms of becoming a more modern club, and football is becoming a real modern game as well, and the celebrity aspect to it is coming into it. And Lee Sharp is apparently a massive celebrity in Manchester at this time.
Oh yeah, Lee Sharp with what looked like a haircut, a cross between Gareth Gates and Justin Timberlake, but impressive. Like, him and Giggs were at a crossroads, and one of them went one way and the other one went the other. And I think I know which one I prefer to be, but
Lee Sharp.
Absolutely. But no, you're totally right. And Ferguson, like the whole thing with David Beckham, which obviously blew up at the turn of the century there with Victoria Beckham and all that went with that. And the way Ferguson used to speak about players' social lives, it was a bit untoward, I always thought. It always jarred with me a little bit that he was basically talking about David Beckham's wife in disparaging terms. I just thought, imagine Beckham said anything about Lady Cathy, the way, if the shoe was on the other foot, I don't think he'd take too kindly to it. And I think in this documentary, I'm not sure what exactly they were talking about. They don't give the preamble to the conversation, but Martin Edwards is listing off certain players, and he's like, the two Nevilles, Beckham, and Ferguson goes, are they going to that Spice thing? So presumably a Spice Girls concert, and Ferguson wasn't taken too kindly to that. But Strachan, who you mentioned, Enda, probably the Steve Kerr of this documentary, in the sense that he made the most of all the screen time that he got. And interesting point about Ferguson driving past his house and spying to see if he was in or not, and he called him a sad little man. It's just like Strachan and Ferguson's rivalry is one of the most entertaining things in football. Ironically, I think it was definitely the case a couple of months ago that Strachan's son is assistant manager to Darren Ferguson at Peterborough. So right. I think they've managed to build that bridge ultimately. That all stemmed, as far as I know, from Strachan signing a pre-contract agreement with Cologne when he was at Aberdeen, and that's where the little rivalry stemmed between the pair. But just to bring it back to United in the 90s, you're right, and I think Ciaran alluded to Martin Edwards in the boardroom. I thought that was one of the most interesting scenes of the documentary, where Martin Edwards, it's actually quite prescient given the week that Alexis Sanchez stepped out the door. Martin Edwards says, supporters want you to buy anyone, they don't care if it's 3 times the wages of the existing stars. And that's kind of true. If you look at Twitter these days, United fans don't really care about the inner workings of a coronavirus torn boardroom. They only care about Jadon Sancho coming in the door. And whatever United were doing, they were always married to that structure that Ferguson had instilled. And again, in that same scene, Martin Edwards says that Paul Scholes is about to come in and sign a 7-year contract.
Yeah.
So it just, like, Paul Scholes, I'm all for him, but a bit of naivety there. Maybe bring an agent to those negotiations, Paul.
Well, when we're sticking to the Last Dance analogies, I suppose that has a bit of a Scottie Pippen about it. Signing a contract that's going to be worth double the amount in a couple of years' time. One of the more interesting parts of this, I mentioned it before, is Lee Sharp. And Ronan, you alluded to it there, but for anyone who hasn't seen it, essentially Lee Sharp and Ryan Giggs are the 2 young up-and-coming stars at United. And Sharp he'd done everything. He'd bought a drum set, he bought a fancy car, a fancy house. And Ferguson essentially comes over and chucks him out of the house that he bought, told him to get rid of the drum set, and said, you're out in your ass, you're back to digs. And Lee Sharp went back to digs. I mean, like that's, you can't imagine a modern manager doing any of the sorts. But I suppose that shows you the control. And Gordon Strachan is an interesting case in this, because I was actually kind of taken aback by the fact that he was in this. But you can see that amount of sort of micromanagement that Ferguson did with the players didn't grind too well with Strachan, for example, or with several other players. But I suppose the players that he got the most off really bought into that, Ciaran.
Yeah, Strachan, I think, is the most fascinating character in this, because the rest of them, even for all the star power of the likes of Cantona, Giggs, Sharp, whatever, these are people within kind of Ferguson's kind of sphere of influence. But Strachan's just not having any of it. And the thing is, I remember actually, and I'd be paraphrasing here, but when Ferguson was first announced as United manager, the likes of Whiteside and whoever would come up to Strachan, because he obviously knew him from Aberdeen, and would ask them, what are we looking at here? And he'd be like, just wait, lads, this is, the fun times are over, kind of thing. So it takes a lot of balls for someone like Strachan to go up against Ferguson, because God Almighty, that man was menacing. Like the one that cracks me up in the documentary was Neil Cooper being in the bar and ordering this Bacardi and Coke, and Alex Ferguson sneaking up, like basically out of a pot plant or whatever, and just being like, "What's that? Is that cool?" Anyway, but and then he goes up, eyeballs Neil Cooper and says, "You're dead." Which is absolutely amazing. So Ferguson had this absolute iron grip over the club that, we've seen over the years a lot of players fall out with him. I mean, I don't even need to list them really because they're all so well known. But Strachan deserves credit for that. I think one point I would make as well, we were talking about the boardroom. What's really interesting is you're seeing a nascent kind of Peter Kenyon come in there. Kenyon came into the club in 97, and this was obviously from 98. Left the club in 2005. And if you look at that 8 years, and I dislike Peter Kenyon immensely for a number of reasons, mainly the moustache. But realistically, he coincided with one of the most successful periods in the club's history. And he did things like take out the football club on the badge, so it just said Manchester United because of a branding thing. So, perhaps ahead of his time, even if it is slightly soulless and kind of plastic. But this was the development of, this was United in the midst of developing into this global super brand, super club. And I just found that really, really interesting.
Yeah, and another part of this documentary that sort of illustrates how strongly Ferguson wanted to be successful, and this is probably where his personality comes into it, and whether or not you have a strong enough personality to stand up to him like Gordon Strachan, or whether you're just going to buy into everything he does, was when he says to the players that he hadn't seen his kids. He's only really getting to know his kids now, and his kids were semi-growing up at this point because he spent so much time at work, and he told them that he expected them to do the exact same thing. So you're either going to buy into that or you're not. And I suppose either way you could make an argument that the players who didn't buy into it were right, and either way you could make an argument that the players who did were correct as well. One thing I did want to touch on is what you sort of alluded to there, Ciaran, is how much progress United made in terms of being a club and being a brand, and sort of really getting into the modern side of football in terms of the amount of money they're bringing in and the amount of money they're spending. Do you think, Ronan, that Ferguson was a little bit lucky in his timing, that he was taking over United probably at the cusp of the biggest amount of money that the game had seen at that point?
I think the timing of that first championship, given that it was the first Premier League year, really propelled Manchester United in a way that other teams hadn't been afforded. You would have seen in decades previous that the title was almost shared around. Everyone could feasibly compete if you put good structures in place and good recruitment and so on. That's obviously not the case now. It's a bit ring-fenced, that Leicester exception aside, which was obviously such a exception to the rule. But back then, the money that came with being champions in 92, 93, it kind of copper-fastened Manchester United's progress and let them invest. And that just kept snowballing, where they could just build on that 92, 93 win. They'd obviously come close in seasons before that, but given the TV revenue that was about to come in, as you alluded to there, it really set the stall out and let them 13 championships. At this point, I think he'd bagged maybe 4 or 5 by the time this documentary was made. So think that there were 9 more to come. I don't think many people who sat down and watched this on ITV after Coronation Street thought, this man has 9 more championships in him, but it just shows the level of achievement. But Gordon Strachan had a really good quote. I thought the closing scenes in this documentary were excellent from a directorial point of view. The bit with Cantona getting up to walk away, I just thought it was a nice touch. But Strachan says he's obsessed with winning, but he's one of the lucky ones, because if you're obsessed with something and you don't succeed, you become a lunatic. And how true is that? You see so many former great players who try and segue into management and they can't. It's such a trope, but people always say they can't transplant their own ability into their players, and it frustrates the hell out of them. Whereas Ferguson, having not come from quite that level of playing ability, it was just this perfect marriage of his drive and determination that you two have mentioned there with the players at his disposal, and it just gelled really well. I thought Strachan summed it up very nicely there.
Yeah, and I suppose the closing scene with Bobby Charlton as well, describing Alex Ferguson saying that he was destined to be a manager, and Fergie would probably turn around and say that he was a footballer first who went on to be a manager, but in Bobby Charlton's eyes, Ferguson was born to be a manager, and I suppose that ties in well as well. And Cantona's closing scene is very emotional in terms of he's thanking him for everything he's done in his career. And I suppose, in a way, Cantona saved Alex Ferguson's Man United career, but likewise, Ferguson probably saved Eric Cantona's career, Ciaran.
He certainly elevated it. Yeah, Cantona added both the technical and personality, technical skill and personal kind of strength to that squad to really get them over the line and become a talisman that the club has rarely ever seen, or at least hadn't seen since George Best. It's interesting that Cantona kind of made an appearance later, because one of the opening scenes, I remember Ferguson's on the treadmill in the gym. And by the way, has a cup of tea instead of a bottle of water beside him, which is a lovely little touch. Most Glaswegian thing ever. But it reminded me of the letter that Ferguson sent to Cantona after his retirement, which was a really lovely, friendly letter. It wasn't kind of paternalistic or like from a boss to an employee. It was very much like, look, listen, just make sure you keep on top of your health. That's the one thing that I would say from my kind of the years that I have on you. So that was obviously very interesting. But Cantona, look, I mean, Cantona is, as a United fan, without a shadow of a doubt, my favourite player ever, because he held himself with something akin to a kind of, a godlike status to a 7 or 8 year old me. And I think it's interesting that Ronan mentions the Sky Sports element there, because I think you can, if you're a producer, you can pick up on something like that and elevate it to something that isn't. And I remember, there's like the Nike advert that's in there, in the documentary as well, with kind of Cantona sat on his throne, like this kind of Caravaggio Renaissance piece. So he was a gift to both Manchester United and to the league, and he undoubtedly elevated United. And also, like, just one other point I would make in terms of where Ferguson got like early doors, he just wasn't up against an enormous amount once. Like, there was a lot of upheaval at like the likes of Liverpool with Souness or Arsenal early on with kind of, latterly George Graham and Bruce Rioch. So there were no challengers that were really, providing a consistent competition to Ferguson. So, and then what you realise is that he's at his best when he's got a challenger on his tails, when he's got, a Wenger or a Mourinho or a Keegan or whoever it might be. So, it was fascinating, and Cantona plays a key role for sure.
Yeah, I agree totally with that. I mean, if you look throughout the years, the Premier League was the birth of the top four, and that was sort of the idea behind it, was the biggest clubs like Man United, Arsenal, Liverpool. They all got together and essentially said that they were the biggest pulling power, and since then there hasn't been as many challengers as there would have been back then, but all 3 to 4 clubs were in a bit of turmoil at the early start of the 90s, and then later 90s, then we see them progressing into the super clubs that they became. But before we finish up, we only have a couple of minutes left. There's been a lot of revisionism in terms of Man United in the last couple of weeks. I saw a few weeks ago the debate of, was David Beckham ever really that good, sparking up on Twitter. So you always see the argument between Paul Scholes and Gerrard and Lampard, etc. But the David Beckham stuff, Ronan, it's to rob a phrase from Gary Breen, it's a nonsense. Obviously David Beckham was a great player.
Oh, totally. And to say that he was a complimentary player in that team, that's relative to Cantona, you've just spoken about, or Roy Keane, who was basically doing the job of 2 people in midfield there. Beckham brought a whole other toolkit to the thing that wouldn't, like the Champions League in 99, Solskjaer obviously ran away with the credit for that winning goal, but the deliveries from those corners, like, those are David Beckham specials, so he was a keystone member of that treble-winning side, and played out of position that night, obviously, given the suspension. So to suggest that he wasn't a crucial member of the Manchester United story through the 90s is nonsense. I just wonder, you mentioned the Cantona letter, and it's interesting because I'd say him and Ronaldo are the only 2 people who left Old Trafford of their own accord, and Ferguson didn't hold it against them. Because Beckham, and I alluded to it there with the whole Victoria thing, Beckham was just a unique character. He didn't care. He knew his brand was going to, it almost outstripped Manchester United at one point, and no one's bigger than the club and all that. But if you're going to make the argument, I'd say he probably got as close as anyone did. And he played Ferguson at the game, and you'd have to argue Beckham probably won the game. He went to Real Madrid. It propelled him to a whole other level on a global scale. The LA experiment obviously didn't work too well on the footballing front. I think he regretted it footballing wise almost immediately, given that he tried to get every loan possible to keep himself in the England team, but then ended up at Milan. So on the whole, you can't knock Beckham's resume, his CV, and to suggest that his ability is overrated is absolute nonsense. Just pull up any old footage of David Beckham playing football, and you'll see that it wasn't all just technique. His work rate was almost second to none. He set the tone. If David Beckham was putting a shift in akin to the likes of Lee Cattermole or Park Ji-sung, and also bringing that unbelievable set-piece delivery to the party, he was definitely an automatic on the team sheet when he was in his peak.
Yeah, and I suppose the latter days, David Beckham, I can understand why people sort of make the argument that was he that good. I suppose he took his brand a bit more seriously than his football when it came down to it, when push came to shove. But if you look at David Beckham's career, I mean, all the trophies for Man United, then he moved to Real Madrid. I know LA Galaxy is a bit of a shift in pace, but then you have AC Milan, and they weren't the AC Milan of now. They were a good side back then. They had Ronaldinho playing for them at that point. Pirlo was playing for them at that point as well, and then he moved to PSG in his latter days as well. So it's a bit
not bad.
A reasonable successful career for David Beckham overall, I would say. But just before we finish up, Ciaran, a word on the United tactics, because that's another thing that has been brought up. Was Alex Ferguson actually that revolutionary when it came to his tactics? Did he change much from the 4-4-2 formation? But if you look at the progression from the 99 team to the 2008 team and to the title-winning side before he retired, there is a real shift in sort of the 4-4-2 he started off with in the 90s, getting the ball out wide, getting as many crosses into the box as possible, to the really fast-paced counter-attacking football that we remember with the 08 side.
Yeah, the shape was different. I think the ethos was largely the same. And it was interesting seeing the development of players like, for example, Scholes, in terms of people who would have been throughout that period. The same with Ryan Giggs as well, into fitting into different roles within the team. Scholes obviously dropping significantly deeper, Giggs moving centrally at times. I think, I'm kind of ambivalent really on where Ferguson is tactically. I don't really think that. First of all, he says that is his strength. That's the reason he employed the likes of Carlos Queiroz and to a lesser extent Stephen Claren in roles where they could take the lead on that coaching side of things. I think his strengths are many and well reported. Just one point I would make just on the Beckham thing there. Sorry to round back. It's a slightly irritating argument because people are looking back now in 2020 to the late 90s, early 2000s, and trying to apply values, i.e. the things that are valuable in football now, to then. So, for example, Beckham was very possibly the best person in the world at crossing, long-range passing and free kicks. Now, that was at a time where people were playing 4-4-2. You were having, latterly at least, players like Ruud van Nistelrooy coming to the club. Obviously, I realise that Beckham and Van Nistelrooy didn't cross over, but those kind of players. So it's like having whoever you want to call Kevin De Bruyne, David Silva, a person absolutely adept at these slide rule passes. And also, he was extremely hardworking, and that's not something that you should do down. That's not a negative. That's actually something that he has in common with the likes of Cristiano Ronaldo. So I think, just to kind of link the two together, Ferguson's tactics were led by the players that he had at his disposal, and I think he got the best out of the players that he had in his charge, and that's very much to his credit.
Well, I suppose the closest example I can think of to what David Beckham does in the modern game, and I completely agree. I almost hate talking about it, because the argument that a player in the 90s wouldn't fit into a team now it's impossible to tell, because the tactics are so different. The game has developed so much. But David Beckham is the same as Trent Alexander-Arnold, except he was playing right mid and Trent is playing right back. But technically, Trent isn't playing right back. He's playing as a right midfielder in the right back position. So it's essentially the same job, same role, get the ball out wide, get crosses into the box, the same as Trent does all the time. So the idea that David Beckham, it made me laugh a little bit that he wasn't a good player, all the success that he had. And even like if you take for example the arguments and head-to-heads that he had with Alex Ferguson, yet Ferguson still picked him in his team week in, week out, shows you how good he was as part of that team and as part of that system. But Ronan, I'm taking from your answer that, you know, Ferguson, he wasn't that great as a manager. He's just good at appointing different people to different roles, and tactically he wasn't really there. Is that what I'm getting?
Tactically naive.
Yeah. It did bring a little tear to the eye to see Brian Kidd in all his Manchester United garb, given that he's gone across the city now and will probably sadly be remembered more as a Man City coach, which is a bit depressing. But obviously his playing days are his glory days at Manchester United, which will never be forgotten. But it's tough. Like, I would have always had that presumption. It's probably been ingrained in my mind that Ferguson wasn't that adept from a coaching perspective. But you see in the opening salvos of this documentary that he is a training ground coach. He's out there giving Pallister both barrels, I think it is, and working on team shape. So it's not as if he just handed all the reins over in that department. But the appointments of the likes of Carlos Queiroz, given his personality probably didn't jive all that well with Roy Keane, most notably. But he did probably bring United on a little bit in terms of their tactical sophistication, especially in those European games. I know Man United fans were a little bit aghast at watching them play 4-5-1 in your big European games, but that was just trying to match the system that had sort of been their undoing in the Leverkusen game that Ciaran mentioned, and a few others. We could probably, lads, if we want to do another pod on United's near misses in Europe, I'm all for it, because like there are many. The Bayern one in particular, the Arjen Robben volley, where that was just, talk about a wide open European Cup. Like I think if United had overcome Bayern that night, they were probably the best team in Europe that year. And there's a few other ones, but on the whole, what Alex Ferguson brought to the table from a managerial standpoint is probably not the same that the likes of maybe Pep Guardiola are bringing, but you know, it's all checks and balances. Like, it's all what Ferguson lacked, he made up for in all departments, in all other departments. And similarly, where Pep falls down, he's probably stronger than Ferguson. So it's hard to compare managers, much like you said. It's difficult to compare players from different eras. What you're dealing with varies from generation to generation. But to suggest Ferguson wasn't tactically clued in, again, is a bit of a misnomer, I'd say.
And on that note, that's all we have time for on this documentary. Lads, thanks very much.
Cheers, Enda.
Cheers, lads.
Short break.